Greetings and salutations, my history-loving mischief. Brian Guthrie, aka Guthron the Balding Bard here. Oh, for those new to the channel, this is my rat avatar. Rats are the mascot of the channel, and a mischief is a group of rats. There are other words for it, but I love calling my audience a mischief or mischief makers. All in good fun. Anyway, today we're going to explore a new topic from a new assignment. Well, it's not a new one, just new to this channel. We were tasked with creating a project that made use of at least 30 different primary sources. We were also tasked with using local sources to get said primary sources. Yes, this is the same class for which the Whitehead Memorial Museum short take on local history video was made. Check my channel if you want to watch it. For this one, I decided to create a project that touched on both local and national history and made use of a museum designed precisely for this topic, the U-2 Aerial Intelligence Platform and the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a large topic, so over time and through research and interviews, I narrowed the topic down to focusing on the actual aircraft present at Laughlin Air Force Base during the crisis and its aftermath. Specifically, we'll be focusing on two planes designated by their tail numbers throughout the video, so we better get started. First, we will touch briefly on the U-2 airframe, discussing what it is, how it has been used, and some of the important events it has taken part in. This will dovetail into a brief overview of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U-2's grand entry onto the national stage. Following that, we'll focus on two of the planes specifically, telling their story and what eventually happened to them. Finally, we'll discuss the future of those two planes with special focus on the local connection of one of them. One note for you from the outset: almost all of the imagery you will see in this video is from the Laughlin Heritage Foundation Museum. Additionally, almost every reference to events and pilots comes from static displays at the museum, with some information coming from other primary sources available online. Some of the images will be taken from Lockheed Martin and the Air Force's official websites. A few will come from archives.gov and LOC.gov. All videos taken belong to the news agencies that filmed them. For specifics, see the credits at the end and the description. So let's start with the plane itself. The U-2 is a high-altitude, all-weather intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, hereafter ISR, near-space aircraft capable of reaching altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet. Because of this, the pilots must wear full-pressure suits like those worn by astronauts. By the way, what's happening here? That's so frightening, and that's on display in the Laughlin Heritage Foundation Museum. In truth, it's just fog on the pilot's helmet, but that's not what it looks like. Very weird core, that image. Moving on, the aircraft contains one engine and one seat. Its long, narrow wings allow it to glide when necessary. It can operate during the day or at night to bring imagery intelligence, hereafter IMINT, electronic measurements and signature intelligence, hereafter MASINT, and signals intelligence, hereafter SIGINT, to customers around the world. It has also seen use in massive peacetime operations, including disaster zone searches like the 2011 tsunami that struck Japan. It has proven to be a venerable airframe that, with ongoing upgrades, continues to operate today. The version being flown today is the result of several generational upgrades since the plane's first test flight in 1955. There have been many variants of the U-2 over its lifespan, with many situational necessities driving the upgrades. For this discussion, we will primarily be discussing the C, E, and F variants of the airframe. One other thing I'd like to point out at this point was that these airframes were built by hand, with modifications being made the same way. As a result, they all flew a little differently. Tail number 680, for example, was famously described as the perfect handling aircraft, a description some pilots beg to differ with after flying it. The airframe's most famous uses occurred during the Cold War, when it operated over Communist Russia from 1956 through 1960, and, more importantly for this discussion, Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia in 1960, he was flying the C variant. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, most of the aircraft flown were the E or F variants. Now let's move on to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will not go into a lot of detail on the major events. I recommend checking out Extra Credits 3-part special on the event for a good overview of the major players and what happened. A link will be in the description. With Cuba seen as a communist satellite state for projection of the Soviet Union's power, the US government made use of the U-2 to provide IMINT of any notable activity. They had done this almost continuously after the Bay of Pigs debacle. However, an accidental U-2 overflight of Russia, combined with the loss by way of a surface-to-air missile, hereafter SAM, of a Taiwanese-flown U-2 in the West Pacific earlier in 1962, had led to a temporary halt in the airframe's use in intelligence gathering in hopes of waylaying growing international concerns of conflict. Wow, that sentence was a mouthful. Yes, you did hear that correctly. Taiwanese-operated U-2s. In fact, several Chinese pilots were trained at Laughlin Air Force Base, forming what would become the Black Cat Squadron later in operations. This is their patch, and here is an image of several of them years later. The existence of these pilots training in Texas was not widely known, as you might expect. This comic details a funny incident when a Chinese pilot had to make an emergency landing and frightened the locals when he showed up asking for help. Learning something new here, aren't we? During another incident, this one serving as one of the aircraft's first appearances for a general public audience, Lieutenant Ford Lowcock decided to conduct a private air show for his wife and 2 kids. He flew in a pattern over his house in Del Rio, Texas, but made an error that prevented him from bringing the aircraft out of a spiraling turn. The plane came down in a field near the public airport and flipped upside down. Lieutenant Locock was knocked unconscious during the crash landing and died from asphyxiation. A young Jim Long, historian at the Laughlin Heritage Foundation Museum in Del Rio, Texas, went out to the site and saw the wreckage. Incidents like this one led to calls for an ejection seat to be installed in the airframe, which previously did not have them. Here you can see some actual ejection seats from planes of that era on display at the museum. Returning to the crisis, the ban on overflight included Cuba, leading to a 5-week gap in coverage through September and October of 1962. When the need for actionable imminent became critical, operational control of the U-2s was passed to the U.S. Air Force. It was believed that this would cause less suspicion if another U-2 was shot down. The Air Force placed the airframes in the 480th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, hereafter SRW, Strategic Air Command, hereafter SAC, and painted United States Air Force insignias and tail numbers on them. This included tail numbers 680 and 707, which we will discuss again in a moment. Most of these flights launched from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida. However, several were based and launched by the 4028th Strategic Reconnaissance Weather Squadron, hereafter SRWS, from Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. Major Rudolph Anderson, the most famous participant in the U-2's coverage of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was stationed at Laughlin. The house that he lived in still exists, and this historian actually lived directly next to it for several months in 2021 without even realizing its significance. However, I digress. On October 14th, a U-2F variant flown by Major Richard Heiser took 928 pictures that revealed during post-mission analysis the existence of Soviet missile base under construction. By the way, as an aside, here you can see what the bottom of the U-2 plane would have looked like under the pilot where he would be taking the pictures. And here you see an actual camera on display that was used during the crisis. Throughout said crisis, SAC had permission to conduct as many overflights as they deemed necessary, launching and recovering missions from McCoy and Laughlin Air Force bases and conducting mission analysis of the imminent captured on site before sending it up the chain of command. Most of the airframes flown were the E variant with the improved J57 engine. This meant they could fly higher than the previous versions. Tail numbers 680, 703, and 707 were the first to undergo conversion to the E model. A few were retrofitted to be refuelable in air. However, according to Jim Long, only one mission was flown during the crisis that made use of this feature. That flight was done by pilot Pat Allen. The missions continued without incident until October 27. On that day, the aforementioned Major Anderson, at the time launching from McCoy Air Force Base, took off on his 6th mission. It was a regular pattern for Laughlin's U-2s to launch, conduct their mission, and then land at McCoy. Anderson's flight path took him near Bonis, Cuba, on the northeastern edge of the island nation. As he continued, orders were issued at the local level to shoot him down using SA-2 SAMs. 2 SAM missiles were launched, with one detonating close enough to Anderson's aircraft to send shrapnel ripping through the fuselage. One of those fragments punctured Anderson's pressure suit, leading to decompression and near-instant death. His demise was officially announced by the UN Secretary General U Tant on October 31st, and his body was returned to the US 4 days later. He was laid to rest in his home state of South Carolina. The remnants of his aircraft, tail number 676, remain on display at various locations in Cuba. After this event, SAC retained control of the Cuban overflight missions, which continued into the 1970s under the codename Olympic. One other pilot lost his life during missions near Cuban airspace. Captain Robert Hickman, flying near Cuba, lost consciousness when his oxygen system malfunctioned. The plane, using autopilot, kept flying along its path, eventually running out of fuel and gliding down to crash into a mountain in Bolivia. Now let's move on to discussing the U-2s taking part in the crisis, specifically the tail numbers I mentioned before, 680 and 707. These two tail numbers were well known by the pilots during the event. 680 was nicknamed Sick 80, while 707 was called the Hangar Queen because they spent so much time in the hangar at Laughlin Air Force Base. As I mentioned above, these planes were the first E variants, and throughout the crisis they each spent a lot of time having modifications done to them in the hangar away from prying eyes. A lot of equipment, including experimental stuff, would get placed on these airframes for use in upcoming missions. A note on the color. A unique aspect to these airframes was the paint scheme, which was a custom color invented by Lockheed Martin. When they started, most were painted an aluminum color that was inspected and replaced as necessary with the new gray color. By the time of the crisis, all of the aircraft were painted gray, with distinctive Air Force insignia and other markings placed all over the aircraft, as you can see in these pictures. For now, we'll put a pin in the paint and come back to it. Tail 680 was first delivered to the CIA in 1956 and saw some action in Europe initially. It was transferred to SAC control and was used by Lockheed Martin for testing, as we mentioned above. The CIA regained use of 680 in 1963 and converted it to the new G variant. According to Jim Long, 680, along with 707, conducted some of the first trans-Pacific missions for operations over Vietnam. Here, we see an image of 680 on deployment in Vietnam bearing the oddly shaped ram's horn antennas as a further sign of the airframe's continuing upgradability and this particular aircraft's use as a prototype model for new systems. Note also the color. Keep that in mind. This was where the refuelability came in handy, although it wasn't often fuel that was a limiting factor on mission length as much as pilot fatigue. The aircraft is notoriously difficult to fly under perfect conditions owing to its unique design. Moving on, Tail 707 first entered use in May 1957 as a part of the 480th SRW, performing various missions as another test aircraft for several years. It underwent the conversion to the E variant in 1962, with that conversion ending and the airframe returning to mission just after the 13 days typically called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It continued operating in overflight missions, later becoming a refuelable F variant in 1966. It was briefly placed in flyable storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in 1969 for being recalled in 1972 to service, where it was converted back to a C variant to help monitor nuclear tests by France in the Pacific. It finally ended up in storage in Palmdale, California in 1980. Several other tail numbers beyond these two and 703 were based out of Laughlin, including 696, 700, 720, 721, and 708. You can see several of them in this photograph from 1962. By the way, I apologize for the glare, as it was impossible to get the right lighting on this photograph. Here we see a rare photograph of multiple U-2s sitting on the tarmac at Laughlin Air Force Base. Tail number 700, pictured here, flew the last official sortie for the U-2s flying out of Laughlin Air Force Base on June 12, 1963, as the 428th moved to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Note again the paint scheme of 700 before it took off and left Laughlin Air Force Base. So what became of tail number 680 and 707? Well, after 680 was retired, it eventually ended up in the Smithsonian Institute, delivered in parts and assembled inside the building. It has been on display there for many years. As you can see, they painted it in a distinct pattern that does not resemble what it looked like all those years ago when it flew out of Laughlin Air Force Base. And what of 707? Eventually, it returned to Laughlin Air Force Base to go on static display, and it is still there today. One note regarding the arrival of 707 at Laughlin Air Force Base. This news article tells of the arrival of that plane. However, the one pictured here is an R-57, not a U-2. Additionally, this article went on to say that all of the planes left Laughlin Air Force Base in July of 1962, which would have been several months prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The errors of newspaper publishing. Here you can see it sitting in Heritage Park. Note the paint is similar to the scheme it would have worn in 1962. According to Jim Long, there have been discussions recently by Laughlin Air Force Base's leadership to repaint the aircraft black, the color the fleet has worn most of its life. This historian joins Jim Long and the people at the Laughlin Heritage Foundation Museum in hoping this does not happen. It is a piece of history, conducting most of that history wearing the special gray paint Lockheed Martin came up with in the 1950s. To the leadership at Laughlin Air Force Base, this historian asks that you put into policy that 707 will retain its current paint scheme. She flew that color during her most famous missions. She deserves to rest in that color. Well, that's all for this discussion. See, I told you the paint would come up again. Regarding the plans for painting the aircraft, as of the filming of this video, I am unaware of what plans are in the works, if any. The Foundation expressed that there had been some discussions and that the issue had never really been resolved. Here's hoping it has been and the plane can continue to appear as it did when it first flew over Laughlin Air Force Base in the 1950s. Thanks for tuning in. As I said in another video, I will be taking a break over the holidays. Look forward to more of these discussion videos in January. Happy holidays!